Welcome everybody to our conversations meeting today. We have a wonderful audience. I'm so glad to see all of you with us today, but we have a wonderful speaker, and I think that brought so many of you here. So it's an absolute pleasure for me to introduce our internet conversation speaker today, Dr. Natalie Uomini. And Natalie and I first met, I should say, I was delighted to first meet Natalie at a Templeton Foundation, a meeting many years, I guess it was about 2 years ago. And I think we immediately bonded. I'm just been fascinated with her work. Natalie is a senior scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. She received her BA in cognitive science and linguistics at the University of California in San Diego. She then did 2 master's degrees, one in linguistics and teaching French as a foreign language at the University of Grenoble. She did her second MA in biological anthropology at Durham University, and then completed her PhD in evolutionary anthropology and archaeology at the University of Southampton in the UK. So with this very interdisciplinary and unique combination of talents and expertise, Natalie now integrates and uses this interdisciplinary expertise to investigate the continuities in evolution, in the evolution of cognition across species, including us human species. And she has a specific focus on tool use, intelligence, and communication. Natalie, we are so thrilled to have you with us here today and to hear about your research, and I'll just turn it right over to you. Oh, and by the way, Natalie has been working with us as a member of our ethics working group with the Interspecies Internet. So I just want to say thank you, Natalie, for being such a great member of our group too. You've brought so much to the Interspecies Internet already. So I'll turn it over to you now. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Diana. I'll just start my screen sharing here and put it into presenter mode. So I hope that's all right now. And I just need to hide the controls there. So I hope everyone can see my screen. So thanks, Diana, for this wonderful introduction. My name is Natalie Uomini, and yeah, as Diana mentioned, we connected through the Interspecies Internet. And so here I am. I'm really delighted actually to be here. Before I start my talk, I'd like to acknowledge the sponsors who've supported the research that I'll be presenting today. So the Templeton World Charity Foundation, the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology have been supporting this work. And myself, I'm really delighted to be here in front of all of you. It's a real pleasure to be with like-minded people who really believe in interspecies communication. And this is going to be the focus of my talk today, in particular with crows. But I'd like to start just with a brief background to myself. I'm sitting actually at the intersection of multiple disciplines. And as Diana so kindly mentioned, I have degrees in cognitive science, in linguistics, anthropology, and archaeology. And as a postdoc, I've been working in neuroscience and animal behavior. And the different research topics that I've been pursuing in my academic career have been at the intersections to where these disciplines meet. So for example, animal minds, language, animal communication, language evolution, cognitive evolution, origins of language, and tool making. And the kind of line of research that I've been following for the last 10 to 15 years is about language and tools in particular, as these were first thought to be features that make humans special. And in fact, as we know, other animals also do make tools, possibly also have language. And my interest is in finding out what are the types of intelligence that underlie these linguistic and technological skills. And in fact, I think that we are actually not so special as we used to think. So in my talk today, it's about conversations with crows. So first I'll briefly define what I mean by conversation in this talk. And then I'll share with you what we know about New Caledonian crows, and I'll share some of the research that I have been doing that's not yet published about their communication. And finally, I'd like to give you some of my thoughts about interspecies communication and what forms it could take, and what are the kinds of things that I think need to be in place before it can actually happen. So conversation is defined in the Cambridge English Dictionary as a talk between two or more people in which thoughts, feelings, and ideas are expressed, questions are asked and answered, or news and information is exchanged. I'll skip the question of whether animals, non-human animals, can be considered people. In this case, we're talking about individuals. But the point here is that it's about an exchange of thoughts, feelings, ideas, questions, news, or information. And so this is the core of sort of what kinds of things are being exchanged between two individuals. When we look at the kingdom of life, the animal kingdom, and even the plants, we could ask, well, do these individuals exchange thoughts, feelings, ideas, questions, news, or information? And in fact, I think all biologists would say that yes, practically every life form on the planet does exchange at least one of these things. And so, in fact, here we have conversations going on planet Earth in many different forms around us. So this is really the basic definition that I'm talking about today. So when you look at the sort of tree of life, we see we here humans, we're up here, our species is about 10 million years old. The primate clade that we belong to is 74 million years old. And this split here between the branch that led to humans and the branch that led to reptiles and birds is about 310 million years old. And when we go back up this reptiles branch, the bird clade is 150 million years old. And right at the top there, we have New Caledonian crows. They're about 5 million years old. And in fact, New Caledonian crows and humans share some really interesting features. And this is quite remarkable because we consider that there's 310 million years of evolution. In fact, that's 600 million years of evolution in total that separates us. And so this is what makes New Caledonian crows a particularly interesting species to help us understand the different evolutionary features that could have led, on these separate lines, could have led to shared traits today. So I'd like to introduce this wonderful and fascinating species to you. I've been very fortunate to do field work in New Caledonia with these birds. I think most of you in the audience live in a Western country, if I'm not mistaken. So you probably have seen crows in whether you're in North America or Europe. The crows that we know here in Europe or the Americas are about twice the size of these, the ones that you're seeing in the picture here. So they're small sized crow, but they're very large brained. So they're quite fascinating, and they're mostly well known for their ability to make tools and use tools. They also learn. So if you look at the individual here in the middle, that's a juvenile. It has two parents. So the pink mouth is the juvenile, and it's just about to start using a tool that one of its parents has left. And they are very good social learners. They learn these tool making skills from the adults around them. And just like us, they really need a lot of parenting. They need extended parenting to learn these skills. So the species itself has particular features, as I mentioned, that are shared with humans. And Gavin Hunt and I, in our 2016 paper, we argued that they're actually very similar in many ways. So they have a dedicated anatomy for tool use, similar to us. They have a very special shape of their beak, and they also have binocular vision. They also have the largest relative brain size of corvid. That's the brain size compared to their body size. And humans also, we have the largest relative brain size in our clade. They do very fine manipulations with their bill or beak. And this is similar to the way we can use our hands to do very fine things. They also have strong laterality or beakedness, similar to our handedness. And they have these extended childhoods. They're cared for by their parents for 2 years or more, and this is quite unusual. They do use tools to hunt animal prey, just as our ancestors did. And they're vocal learners. So in fact, a lot has been already written about their tool making and tool use ability, but we really don't know much about their vocal ability. And what's so strange about this? Well, vocal learning for a start is pretty unusual in the animal kingdom. There are a few species here and there who have this ability to really imitate any kind of sound that they hear. And in fact, just like humans, they really need to get the input. So they're not born with a repertoire of sounds. They have to get the input from the social group that they grow up with. The same way that humans need to be growing up in a place to learn that language. So my focus today, really in this conversations series, is going to be about vocal communication. I'm not going to talk at all about body language or visual communication, although that is a complete another field. That would be another talk. I'll give you an example here. So this is actually a crow that I met. He grew up with a family. He was rescued as a baby from the nest, so he never got the input from wild crows. And he imitates all kinds of sounds. He pretends to laugh.
Yeah, it's funny.
Isn't it funny how he doesn't open his mouth when he does that?
It's such an...
He barks like a dog. He makes car engine sounds. Imitates the man's voice. Imitates. So it's sort of, this crow, it's a completely tame crow. It's living freely with a family. And it's about 20 years old now, so it has been around humans for a long time. However, I stood in front of this crow and recorded its sounds. I did not feel like I was having a conversation with it. It was simply pouring out the sounds that it had learned to make. And so what I realized then was that to really understand how these crows communicate, I would need to study wild crows living in the forest, in their natural groups, in their natural habitat. So that's just what I set out to do. So now, when we work with human participants in a research, we do this IRB process. We do informed consent. And this is basically a procedure to make sure that our participants are voluntarily taking part in our study. We make sure they have the necessary information, that they can understand the risks, and that the key point is they're free to choose whether or not to participate in our study. And I must say, I'm not trained as a biologist, so I have not been taught the way that biologists do research. And so I'm coming at things kind of in my own way. And I really believe that when working with animals, non-human animals, I believe that we should apply the same standards of respect as when we work with humans. And so I try to make informed consent with birds. So how is this actually possible? Well, here's what I do. So first of all, we measured the first time we arrived there, we measured the flight distance, minimum flight distance, which is a measure that bird experts use. You sort of walk towards the bird, and then you see at which point they fly away. So, and then you measure that distance, and you find out at what distance they feel comfortable with your presence. And so we measured this at about 25 meters. So then we had a protocol in the field that we would always stay 30 meters away from the birds. We never approach them unless they willingly approach themselves. So here we just set up an apparatus, an experiment. And then I don't know if you can see at the far top right of this photo here, the researchers, we sit in chairs and we watch. And the birds are free flying. They roam around the forest. If they want to come to our experiment, they can. And the beauty of this setup is that we know that every single time a bird comes to our experiment, we know that they're always motivated. They're always coming because they want to come. And so, in fact, I've combined these field experiments with systematic observations of these wild birds. And this allows us to keep a rigorous control of variables and a high ecological validity. So I've set up cameras and microphones in the trees, and we filmed and audio recorded these wild crows in their natural habitat. So it really is, in fact, the approach that I'm taking is a complement to the data that's obtained with different types of experiments. Some other researchers like to capture their study animals. Sometimes they handle them, do some manipulations, or treat them with some treatments. And what I'm doing is a complement to that. So I'm really only focusing on the free animal. I don't manipulate them. I don't touch them or approach them. And I gain the information, really valuable information about really what they're doing in their natural life and in their free habitat. So this is what field work looks like on a small South Pacific island. We've set up here, we have fixed cameras, so we have places where we sit and keep cameras, and we also walk around the forest and try to follow the birds as much as possible, as well as setting up automatic cameras on the ground and also in the trees. So I had the great pleasure of climbing some tall trees to set up large audio recorders and video cameras. So what we could do with all this data then, basically we have so much data that our analyses are still ongoing, but we've already broken new ground here. And some of the main points are that I already have the largest collection of video and audio of new Caledonian crows. And I'm working now on how to make this accessible for open science because it's pretty unwieldy. We also have the first observations of some previously undocumented events in the species, such as hunting particular types of prey that haven't been seen before, territory defense, dealing with injuries, and certain courtship behaviors. And what my colleagues and I published in our 2020 paper is that this extended parenting period gives juveniles a safe haven where they can practice the vital skills that both support and enable their large brains to grow. So this has to do with tool making and tool use, as well as communication. So we really want to talk about communication here. So I've brought you some examples from our field work. the first one here is an example of some of the soft calls they make. So you might want to turn up the volume on your computer just for this one. As you can see, they don't always open their beak fully, so they can make a wide variety of sounds even with the closed mouth. We also have some calls that are quite loud. So if it's too loud, you might want to turn down the volume. I think we tested the volume, it should be okay. These are calls that they make, we think, to keep track of each other through the day. This last sound that you saw at the very end here was begging. And in fact, that's what they do when they're asking for food. So this one, I think the other individual was coming with some food. And so that's what was happening here. We also have very interesting call exchanges. So in terms of sort of conversational ability, we do see very often that they, especially in the evening, before, as dusk is falling, they start to regroup. So they actually have like a fission fusion type of social system where they will gather briefly in groups, and then they basically spend most of the day individually or in pairs. And they'll then in the evening gather again before they roost together. And here we had a very interesting call exchange. You'll see me pointing with my finger on the camera the direction of the two individuals who are exchanging calls. So they're exchanging single calls here. And once we zoomed in on the individual on the right who was calling, we could see that they were basically picking up some last few bites to eat before bed. They exchange a few calls, and then in the end they just fast forward it because it's a bit jumpy. So in the end, after this exchange of single calls, then the one individual flew and joined the other one. And this is what we see very often. So we do see these kinds of call exchanges during the day as well, when they've split up. And then we see that they often start to exchange, and these exchanges always end with one of the individuals joining the other. So this makes us quite fairly confident that these are contact calls, which are similar to the ones that are used by some kinds of primates and many other species. This final video clip here is an example of a family group. So the two on the left are juveniles, and the two on the right are two adults, probably their parents. You can see the juvenile in the middle here begging quite a lot. The adults on the right are using tools to probe into this dead wood and get some beetle larvae. And the two juveniles, one of them is begging, the other is sort of probing with its beak, but not using a tool yet. You'll see the adult just extract one grub there at the moment. I think it's not going to feed it to the juvenile. So the juveniles do beg a lot, but they don't always get fed. So this is another point about the extended parenting that's so fascinating, that although the parents really do tolerate these youngsters following them around, and they don't always feed them. So these kinds of sort of different vocal calls that we observe, the first thing we did with our data was try and create our first taxonomy or classification of the different call types. So we define a call as the sound that the bird makes in one breath. And usually if the different sounds are separated by a gap of more than 1 second, then we say it's a different call. And so we made here really a descriptive classification because we don't want to, or we cannot really impose meanings yet on these calls. So for the moment, we start with this simple classification by the number of syllables that's in one of the calls. So single, double, triple, quadruple, or 5 or more. And then there are these begging sounds that they make when they want to be fed. They're quite distinctive. And there are a couple of other unusual and rare sounds that we hear, which we haven't quite been able to classify too well. But what we sort of the different context or meanings that we can see from these examples is, first of all, in an alarm situation, whether there's been a predator or a new person coming into the forest that's an unknown person or a predator. These contact calls that I mentioned, that they keep track of each other through the day when they're visually separated. They also have possibly a call that they use to identify a certain type of new food source. Now, often this is also called in a group when they gather together. And then the softer calls, we're not quite sure. But they do seem to be not directed at other individuals, and they're so soft that really they can't be heard very far away. So we think they might be something like comforting or something else. So this still remains to be seen. But if you're interested to see some more examples of these calls, I've put a few videos on YouTube. You can search under Dr. Nat's research videos or just email me. I'll be glad to send you some links. The second thing we did with our data was to use machine learning to identify the individual crows. This work was done by my project collaborators, Patrick and Cassie of Indiana University. And what they did was really train this computer to identify, first of all, crow sounds from all the background noise in the forest. And the second step is going to be to identify individual crows, basically using their voice signature, their individual voice signature, because we know they most likely have, because other crow species do have individually identifiable voices. Dolphins, for example. So it's very highly likely that these crows also use the voice to identify each other. So this is ongoing work. We have so much data that we're really it takes a long time to prepare it for machine learning. So that's where we are now, but the results have been pretty exciting so far. But there are a few things that we do need in order to really get a handle on what these crows are saying to each other, because they're moving around the forest all day long. As I mentioned, they tend to have efficient fusion social system. So they really, they're moving between groups, or they're moving around different locations on the forest. And in particular, it would be fantastic to be able to track them with GPS so that we can really see how the individuals are interacting with different groups, or different like subgroups, I suppose, and how they move around and how they use the space, because it isn't clear yet whether each family has its own small territory or whether they share, because we do see, for example, at different seasons, different size groups. So there's some really tantalizing glimpses here that we can't quite figure out just from the facilities that we have. So if we could really get GPS tags on every individual, then we'd have a really great tracking ability to follow their movements. Secondly, we really do need some long-term following. So we need to really send researchers out, just like Jane Goodall, following these crows for months and months and months and years on end, to be able to get to know the individuals. It's going to be really essential to learn in what situations the calls are used. So to start to understand the meanings of these different calls, we need to be able to document all the different contexts and situations. And some of the calls are so rare, we only have like 2 or 3 examples of them so far. So these ones especially, you would need more time to be able to collect more examples of those. And thirdly, we need more field sites, because we know that there's cultural variation in the tools that these crows make, and probably also in their vocal communication. So we could probably talk about dialects. And this would be really fantastic if we could have researchers at different locations around the island of New Caledonia and comparing those different groups and different dialects. So those are some of the things that will really help us to get to know, to be able to really listen in more on these conversations. So I want to sort of spend the last few minutes here sharing some of my thoughts about interspecies communication. It's like, you know, what are the things that I think need to be in place if we want to achieve this? In fact, I think there are 5 main prerequisites. So I think sort of, for example, the first prerequisite would be that 2 individuals of different species, they would have to have a shared understanding, or at the very least, a shared goal. And there needs to be something they're aiming for. And they need to have similar thought processes. So for example, if we talk about exchanging, you know, the original definition of a conversation, exchanging information or even emotions, well, those individuals would need to be aware of their own emotions in order to exchange them. So there needs to be something, at least similar goals or similar thought processes. Secondly, I think there needs to be a desire to communicate. So, for example, they need to want to engage with that other individual or that other species. So think of a snail, for example. Like, if we could talk to a snail, really, what would we want to say to it? What would the snail want to say to us? I mean, do we honestly really think there's anything we could talk to a snail about? So I think we have to really consider then, you know, what would be the need for communication, or what would they to get out of it? They also need to have compatible sensory systems. So when you think about all the different modes of communication, by scent or by hearing, by vision, by chemical signals, there's all sorts, and they're not necessarily compatible. And this is key for both the outgoing message and the incoming message. We need to be able to produce signals that the other can perceive, and we have to be able to perceive those signals. So a squid and a bee, I mean, they would really struggle to find some common ground in terms of their sensory systems here. Fourth, I think, you know, when we think about conversation, there has to be turn taking. So there has to be active listening, I think, and active signaling. It cannot work if the 2 individuals are talking over each other. So this is not just mutual eavesdropping, for example. I think there has to be really an active ability to both listen and signal to the other. And the fifth point, I think, is that the individuals need to have matching type of intelligence. So, for example, wolves and orangutans, they both have a very high social intelligence. So this could give them a level on which to start to communicate. I think these 5 points are probably, I'm sure, not the only ones, but to me, these are sort of the core ones. And when we think about what already exists in the world, I mean, there are examples of interspecies communication. The Honeyguide is one of the fascinating ones. Birds are helping humans how to find beehives, and this is known from Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, and several other African countries. And these bird and human, they exchange sounds and whistles, and they monitor each other's movements towards the beehive. So the bird leads the human to the beehive. The human chops down the tree, gets the beehive, and they leave some wax for the birds, which the birds really love. So here they have a shared goal. The shared goal is to get honey or to find a beehive. They have a sensory system, the sense of hearing that they can use to create signals and perceive each other's signals. And they have a reason to communicate. And there are other examples. There were dolphins and fishermen in Brazil who help each other to find fish in the ocean. So there are a few of these examples out there. But I wanted to do a thought experiment and really go into what kind of conversation would you have with a New Caledonian crow based on what we know of their behavior in the wild. Well, we could, for example, they could request food from us. They already do that with each other. They beg to each other. And in fact, I had one experience in my last field season where one of the juveniles came to me and begged at me just as I was refilling the meat that we give them. And so I think they can see us as a food provider. We could also imagine that we could show them a food source. Perhaps we could signal to them that we're bringing food in some way. I think they would have this shared goal of obtaining food. We could perhaps also share each other's location. So this seems to be something they do with themselves, with each other through the day, keeping track and asking each other where they're located. Identification could also be another point. And in fact, we guess that they can identify each other because they do often send calls in a certain direction when they have heard a certain individual calling. They'll orient their body and call back in that direction, even though there might be other individuals in another direction. So it could be useful also for us to identify ourselves as friends, and so they can keep track of who's there and to not know who's dangerous or who might be a friend. And perhaps also we could warn them of danger. So they do have their own warning signs. They have 7 different birds of prey on New Caledonia, and they do signal with certain calls when those are seen. But I don't know if we could actually help them with that. It might be difficult to get them to understand it, but perhaps we could really try some playback experiments where we play those different warning signals and see if they behave appropriately. So those are sort of these are all the points I could come up with in my thought experiment about what could a conversation with a crow look like. And it seems like the sort of points are quite limited. So when we think about what they communicate to each other, this is only what we know, right? They might be communicating all sorts of other things that we haven't got yet. So this is also why we need more research. But in fact, the points that we as humans might have in common with them seem to be rather limited, but still tractable. So I still think this is tractable. So to sum up here, this final slide here is a sort of my conclusion. So I think, first of all, we have to recognize that interspecies communication already exists. It is rare in time and space, but there are cases, active cases, and I think we really need to study them well to understand exactly what makes them successful and or what makes them disappear. New Caledonian crows, I think, are excellent candidates due to those many shared traits they have with humans, such as vocal learning and technical intelligence. I think these shared traits give us many points of contact where we could potentially have shared goals or shared signals. But we do need much more targeted research on this species, in particular in their communication, not only vocal communication, but also physical, visual, and bodily communication. For example, they also can raise their feathers in certain ways. And we know that ravens, American ravens, they use lifting of feathers in different body parts as types of signals. So there's potentially a huge range of different signals they can produce with sound and vision. But I think the main sort of core here is that we need to carefully consider the prerequisites to help us really focus our efforts on the most likely species for interspecies communication. So that we really need to not just try to create something that's universal, but rather to focus there on the pairs of species that will be most likely to have those shared goals and shared sensory systems. So that, I think, is going to be the way forward for interspecies communication. So thanks again, and thank you all for your interest.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for such a wonderful talk. So I think we should open the floor right now for questions. And I'm again, there was a lot to digest there, and we had a few questions early on. Let me, I'll just read off. Let me just get to the list.
I'll unshare my screen now.
I think Vince has a question, Diana.
Yes, well, okay, I was just looking earlier, but Vin, go ahead. Floor is yours.
Actually, you should feel free to prosecute a lot of the questions that popped up. This is a fascinating talk, and so thank you for taking the time to share all this with us. I never did know anything about Caledonian crows, although we have some big fat crows here that appear to be absolutely fearless. You know, they basically are fighting with the squirrels over the food that we leave for both of them. So one question is whether you've observed cooperation between the crows, and if so, what kind of cooperation have you encountered? What were they trying to accomplish? And was there any